Great seeing you here again. My name is Luke Custer, founder of the Custer Academy. And in this video, I will talk about the different parameters that we can consider to evaluate projects. We will look at some financial parameters. We've been talking before in previous videos about payback time, net present value, and internal rate of return. And of course, we also have to consider some risk elements. But before we continue, don't forget to click on the subscribe button, click on the bell button, and every time we have a new video, YouTube will inform you about it. Let's have a look at these different elements. So when we're looking at the project evaluation, I want to concentrate in this video on the financial evaluation parameters. When we look at project selection, we have basically two important elements. We look at risk event, what is the risk level of the project, and on the other hand, what are the financial parameters that we know about the project. When we talk about risk, we also have to consider the risk tolerance of the stakeholders we are dealing with. Some people like to have more risk, love more riskful projects because their return is higher, while other people don't look or don't like that high risk. So we have to understand what is the risk tolerance, what is the risk level of the project. Risk is a very important parameter, and a project with a too high risk level may be, in fact, not selected, may be neglected, may be put back to the drawer, put back to some study to find out if we can find better ways to do the project. So risk is a very important element in project selection. Like I said, we will be talking about financial parameters, and financial parameters we've been talking about in previous videos. We spoke about the payback time, what's the time to recuperate the initial investment. We looked at examples of the net present value, the internal rate of return, and of course there are still other parameters. We're just looking at what we should know as a project manager. And if you really want to go deep in the financial evaluation, your CFO or the financial people in your company will help you with this. Let's have a look at these different parameters one by one. The first element that I want to consider or that I want to discuss is the payback time. The payback time is a very simple parameter. It does not consider the time value of money, but it's so easy to calculate and so easy to use that people like to use it, and that it's used in many cases as a first element when comparing the projects. What is the payback time? We look at the initial investment and we divide it by the cash flows. In the previous video, we looked at the different applications when we have all the same cash flows and net cash flows, or when we have different net cash flows over the lifespan of the project. What is the limit here? Well, it depends on your environment, on your business, on your industry. When we were looking at projects within AT&T, typically people spoke about 3 years, but in some cases it can be a few months, a year. In some cases it can be more. It depends on the industry and the type of project you are doing. Anyway, your management will set those limits and you will be able to understand how to deal with them. It's not so difficult. The parameter is easy to calculate and is typically a first indication about the project success or possible selection of the project for your company. Let's have a look at the net present value. A more interesting parameter that we can consider is the net present value. The net present value compares the discounted value of the future cash flows with the initial investment. The formula is quite simple. We sum all the cash flows over the different time period and we divide them by the discount factor. The discount factor is 1 plus the percentage typically the WACC that you consider, to the power that parameter I relates to the period. So for the first period we have 1, 2, 3 and so on, up till we reach the last period of the project life cycle. We subtract the initial investment, CF0. Here I put a minus sign because in this case I consider CF0 to be a positive value, so it should be here positive. In some cases, in the formulas, we can include the sign in CF0, and then of course we have to change the minus into a plus. What is important here? Well, the project should make a profit. And to make a profit, it means that the net present value should be larger than 0. On the limit, it can be equal to 0, but it's better to have a positive net present value. Positive net present value means that the discounted future cash flows are higher than the initial investment. Another parameter that we can find is basically the internal rate of return. Let's have a look at the rate of return, internal rate of return, and see what we can do with it on our projects. The last parameter I want to show you, and we've done some exercises in the previous videos, is the internal rate of return. The internal rate of return is like the rate of return to obtain a break-even over the project life cycle. And it means that when we, in fact, calculate the net present value with the interest rate being, or the discount rate being equal to the internal rate of return, the net present value should be equal to 0. The internal rate of return is the yield of the investment. And when we're investing money, remember that money costs money. We have to pay to use money. We have to have a kind of interest to pay on it. And we can calculate that for a company which we call the weighted average cost of capital. And the weighted average cost of capital combines all the investment sources and it results in a percentage. What is the percentage we have to pay when we are using the money of the company? Now, the internal rate of return has to be larger than or equal to the weighted average cost of capital. And in some cases, we have to add some percentage to compensate for a risk. Projects with a higher risk profile, risk level, they need to generate a higher return. And then we add that percentage to the WACC, and we call it the required rate of return. I've seen people saying when we calculate the internal rate of return that you have to be happy, when the IRR is positive. Now, I'm sorry, there are words for this, I will not use them, they're impolite, but that's not true. The internal rate of return being positive is not a necessary element to accept the project. The internal rate of return has to be larger than the WACC, or in some cases, the required rate of return, or triple R. When we are looking at projects, we looked at those three parameters, the payback time, the net present value, the internal rate of return. But there are new evolutions, and people are looking at projects in a more general way, more inclusive way. And one of these elements is to consider the life cycle cost of the project. It means we're not just looking at the initial investment, but we're also looking at all the additional things that we have to do over the life cycle of the project. And this can have a very important element where our project may be initially more expensive, but the technologies we use are creating, let's say, or are reducing the costs over the lifespan. But also there may be needs for repairs, for updates, for upgrades, for changes. All these things are related to what we call the life cycle cost. And it's very important today to consider not just the project on its own, but also all the elements, everything that will happen in the future. There are a lot of things to say about the life cycle cost. It will be a completely different series of videos, and it will depend on the industry that you're working in. Anyway, it's very important to consider we have the project, we have the initial investment, but what happens after that? So that was it for this video about the project selection, looking into the payback time, the net present value, the internal rate of return, and some elements about the life cycle costs of a project. That's it. Don't forget to click on the subscribe button, click on the bell button, and every time we have a new video, YouTube will inform you about it. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in our next videos. Bye bye.